Good day, sir. Good day, classmates. Today, we will delve into the profound literary legacy of Jose Rizal, the national hero of the Philippines as a novelist. Rizal, often celebrated for his activism and intellectual prowess, left an indelible mark on Philippine literature with his groundbreaking novels No Limitang Here and El Filibusterismo. These masterpieces not only captivated readers with their compelling narratives, but also served as powerful critics of Spanish colonial rule in the Philippines. Join us as we dissect the anatomy of Rizal's novels, exploring their themes, characters, and the profound impact they had on Philippine society. The paragraph explains that Rizal said Noli Me Tangere was like a bridge connecting two important events: the time when people started speaking out against Spanish rule and when they actually fought back in 1896. It was a warning sign that things needed to change. El filibusterismo was like a big message showing how people were feeling angry and ready to fight for what was right, even though they couldn't fix everything that was wrong. These books were like a big alarm for Spain, showing them that if they didn't start treating the Filipino people better, things would get much worse. Now, we're going to talk about No Limitang Here, which is a really important book written by Jose Rizal. This explains that in 1877, Jose Rizal began famous for writing a book called Limitang Here. This book talked about how the people in the Philippines wanted to be free from the Spanish rulers. It made a lot of people start thinking about their country and wanting to change things. A historian called Jose S. Arcelia called Limitang Here as a gospel of Philippine nationalism, which he means that this book was like the most important message for Filipino people who wanted their country to be free. So, No Limitang Here became like a guidebook for those who wanted to make the Philippines better. The title No Limitang Here means Touch Me Not in Latin, but the novel was also titled The Social Cancer in its English translation. So this explains that the title No Limitang Here means Touch Me Not in Latin. It's like saying don't touch me, but when the book was translated into English it was so called the social cancer. These titles like saying that there's a sickness in society, so whether you call it No Limitang Here or the social cancer, the book is about showing how there are problems in society that need to be fixed. The Novelist plot revolves around Crisostomo Ibarra, the son of a wealthy Creole landlord who is engaged to Maria Clara, the daughter of Santiago de los Santos or Capitan Tiago. Ibarra is sent to abroad to study. The similarities to Rizal's life are obvious. In the story of Noli Me Tangere, there's a guy named Crisostomo Ibarra. He's rich and engaged to a girl named Maria Clara, whose father is Capitan Tiago. Ibarra goes to study in another country, which is a lot like what Jose Rizal did in real life. So the story is kind of similar to Rizal's own life, which makes it even more interesting. Ibarra's father runs afoul of local officials and is accidentally killed by the Spanish tax collector. This explains that in the story, Ibarra's father gets in trouble with some local officials and is accidentally gets killed by the Spanish tax collector. It's a really sad part of the story because Ibarra loses his father and it makes him want to change things in his town even more. Rizal used his novel to criticize the government and the church. In his book, Rizal wanted to show that the government and the church were not doing a good job. He pointed out their mistakes and the bad things that they were doing. Rizal believed that the government and the church needed to change so that people could live better lives. So he wrote his book to tell everyone about these problems and to encourage them to make things better. To explain this paragraph, when Ibarra comes back to the Philippines, he really wants to help his people become independent by teaching them. So he starts a school, but this makes some powerful people angry, and they start causing problems for him. Things get even more complicated when the new priest, Father Salve, falls in love with Ibarra's fiancée, Maria Clara. But their love story doesn't end well, and Father Salvi looks like a bad guy. This part of the story made some priests upset because it showed them doing things they shouldn't be doing. This paragraph explains that at a big event, Ibarra opens his school for everyone to see, but then during a dinner party, Father Damaso says something mean about Ibarra's dead father. Ibarra gets really angry and almost hurts the friar. Because of this, Ibarra gets kicked out of the church and can't see Maria Clara anymore. The friars even stop Maria Clara from seeing Ibarra. Father Damaso sets up Maria Clara to marry a Spanish guy named Linares. So this paragraph explains that things get even more complicated when people accuse Ibarra of planning a rebellion against the government. They find letters from Maria Clara that seem to prove it. Ibarra gets really mad at Maria Clara, but then she tells him that her real father is Father Damaso. Ibarra forgives her for lying. He runs away with his friend Elias on a boat, but they're seen by the police. There's a fight and someone dies, but we don't know who survives. Meanwhile, Maria Clara decides not to marry Linares because she thinks Ibarra is dead. To explain this paragraph, Father Damaso talks to Maria Clara and tries to convince her that Ibarra can't give her the fancy life and status of a Spanish rich person. But Maria Clara says she loves Ibarra no matter what. Then she says she'll kill herself unless she can become a nun. Father Damaso gives in, and the story ends with Maria Clara as a young nun on the roof of the convent, crying about how unfair her life is while thunder and lightning rumbled in the background. Now let's proceed to Noli Me Legere. When we say Noli Me Legere, it is a Latin phrase that means don't read me. The Spanish were furious with Rizal's novel. They refused to allow it to be imported into Manila. As a result, only a small number of copies of Noli Me Tangere entered the Philippines. The friars whom Rizal criticized spoke despairingly on the book and threatened excommunication to anyone who read it. So this explains how that the Spanish people were really angry about Rizal's book. They wouldn't let it come into Manila, the capital of the Philippines, so only a few copies of Noli Me Tangere made it into the Philippines. The friars who Rizal talked about in the book didn't like it at all. They said bad things about the book and even said they'd kick out anyone who read it from the church. The government and military officials responded by beating anyone caught with a book. So this explains when the government and soldiers found people with a book, they would hit them. They didn't want anyone to read it, so they punished anyone who had it. They were really strict about it, trying to stop the book from spreading. Jose Rodriguez, a friar who issued a small pamphlet entitled Kaingat Kayo, warning people not to read the Noli. This explains that a friar named Jose Rodriguez made a little book called Kaingat Kayo, which means be careful in Filipino. He told people not to read Noli Me Tangere. He wanted to warn them that it was a bad book and they shouldn't read it. Augustinian Father Salvador Font expressed censorship and condemnation of the Noli. The Permanent Commission on Censorship of the Philippines, which read and examined very carefully the so-called Tagalog novel, found the book libelous, defamatory, and full of falsehood and calumny, in which the author, Jose Rizal, reveals crass ignorance. This explains that Father Salvador Font, who was an Augustinian friar, also said bad things about Noli Me Tangere. He criticized the book and said it was bad. There was a group called the Permanent Commission on Censorship of the Philippines, and they looked at the book closely. They said it was full of lies and insults, and that Rizal didn't know what he was talking about. A synthesis of the result of the analytical censor summarizes its findings, whose respective titles are: first, attacks on the integrity of Spain, state, and religion. This means that the book was seen as insulting to Spain, both the government and the church. Second, attacks on the administration, the Spanish employees of the government, and the courts of justice. This means that Rizal's book was said to be critical of how the Spanish government and courts were run, and it criticized the people who work for them. Third, attacks on the civil guard. This means that the book also seemed to have negative things to say about the civil guard, which was like the police force back then. To explain this slide, after looking closely at the book, the Commission on Censorship, led by Father Salvador Fan, said: first, they look at the book word for word. Second, they found that the book had ideas from other countries and religions, and its main message was to make people hate Spain. Third, in the Philippines, the censors wanted Noli Me Tangere to be Noli Me Legere, which means don't read me, because they thought it was so bad. To explain the last part, even though a lot of people didn't like it, Noli Me Tangere was really important for Filipino pride. It showed how educated Filipinos called Ilustrados thought about politics. It helped connect the ideas of speaking out against Spain, the propaganda movement, with actually fighting back in the 1896 revolution. With the main character Crisostomo Ibarra dies in the story, Rizal wanted to show that it's important to think for yourself and stand up against unfair rulers. This made people start thinking more critically about Spanish rule and wanting more freedom. And that concludes my part. Thank you for listening. This is Maria Cresty Salas, BS Ed English 4.
Hello everyone. I am tasked to report the predecessors of the Noli. So, have you imagined a mysterious widow hiding in the middle of the night to exact her revenge? This is far from the reality, considering the fact that the setting in Spanish era where women are submissive and conservative in general. La Nova Negra, written by Padre Jose Borges, a predecessor of the Noli, and Pedro Paterno entitled it Ninay, while Guerrero gives this summary, The Love of Lawless. Was there a parallelism between the two novels, The Noli and Ninay? Take a look. The main characters of Noli and Ninay. The characters of the Noli was Elias, Crisostomo Ibarra, and Capitan Tiago, while the main characters of Ninay was Berto, Carlos, and Don Evaristo. So let's hear it, the plot of the two stories. I will first discuss the story of Nole. So Nole, Ibarra is in love with Maria Clara. And then, the father of Maria Clara is the rich Capitan Tiago. As a result of the revolution, Maria Clara has to execute a letter with his father, thus appearing infidel to Ibarra. And Ibarra escapes from the Spanish authority through the help of Elias riding a banca. And believing Ibarra is dead, Maria Clara enters the convent and becomes a nun. While the Ninay story, Carlos is in love with Ninay. The father of Ninay is the rich Don Evaristo. Ninay executes a letter to save her father and seemingly abandons Carlos. Carlos escapes on a ship, and believing that Carlos is dead, Ninay enters the convent and becomes a nun. So, as we notice that they are the same story, but they have uh, differences between the characters in the story. Next, let's discuss the praisers and defenders of the Nole. The Filipino adored Jose Rizal for the book Nole Me Tangere, which had reached the islands before him and had found eager buyers. People said all the characters in the book were real people, as in point of fact, it was the history written with fictitious names. Those who knew Rizal's home well realized that he had seen or heard of the incidents which he had related, and that only the names were new. Crisostomo Ibarra, a youth, goes to Europe to study and to find out how to bless his country, who is Rizal himself. His father has trouble with the friars, is thrown into prison and dies. This is a composite of Rizal's father and mother. Though they were still living when the book was written, hundreds of other martyred men made that part of the story true in every corner of the archipelago. Maria Clara is the Ibarra's sweetheart and fiancée, but because he has trouble with the friars, the girl's father, Capitan Tiago, breaks off the engagement and marries her to another man, which breaks her heart and results in her death. Maria Clara is Leonor Rivera. Tasio, the philosopher, is Jose's brother Pasiano. The people of Calamba with sore anger pointed out all the rest of the characters. Father Damaso, the cruel Dominican friars who claimed the most of the land about Calamba. Poverty-stricken Sisa, a victim of the unjust system, who does not have enough to rest and goes hungry while her boys have a little food. Civil guards arresting Sisa for alleged theft. They had seen them all the time and time again. The book was 1,000 times true. The pictures of the Governor General who requests the Archbishop to cancel the excommunication perfectly represents well-meaning Terrero, who was the Governor General when Rizal reached Manila. Indeed, as Rizal said, every incident in the book had actually happened. Many his friends Rigodor wrote from London one of the scores of delighted comments of Nole Me Tangere. I have today finished your most interesting story, and I confess frankly that I have never read anything true or more gratifying in reference to this shame which courses our society. Who does not know Father Damaso? Ah, I have met him, and although in your brilliant impersonation of him in the novel you had him wearing the garb, dirty Franciscan, always coarse, always tyrannical, always corrupt. I have met him and studied him in real life in the Philippines, at times in the white habit of Augustinian, sometimes as Franciscan, as you have presented him, and sometimes in the bare feet and tunic of a recollect. Your Capitan Tiago is inimitable, combining as he does characters of 2 or 3 of our countrymen. Who does not find those who personify this disgraceful type? A worthy cousin to Ate Isabel, I have met them. The old man Tasha brings to my memory 2 or 3 famous countrymen of ours, those who have fallen during the night, among them the apostate Quaker Francisco Rodriguez, and I remember Father Salve. I remember others whom you and I know whom we cannot yet name. Father Salve is the truest representative of the much vaunted Filipino missionary. How many persons who pretend to know our country will claim that the noble and unfortunate Elias is pure ideal? This type among us will known to you and to me, because we have thought and felt and suffered with them. The good servant Don Primitivo and the wise Sibea picture perfectly the ancient Thomases, Josephs, and the Laterans, full of distinctions and Latin, which is useless for a reason as well as for the life. How many children of my infancy, infatuated with this supposed erudition, still are living? These are really perfect types of the social life of the archipelago. I do not know how to praise Ibarra enough. His life and misfortunes are also like my own humble history. I don't know whether anyone will dare to dispute the absolute truthfulness of this victim of despotism and colonial corruption, but if this should happen, I can point out to him historical facts. It is even better than a photograph. Maria Clara is the sublime type of pure love, of paternal respect, of gratitude, and of sacrifice. There are unfortunate victims of the religious colonial avarice, exiled martyrs who with slight variation can be called Lucia of Imos, Anita of Binondo, Isabel of Pangasinan, and etc. The fanaticism of Hermanas Terceras completes the coloring of this admirable description. If we pass from persons to the politico-philosophical and social implication of this book, it is perfect mirror to some. It hath all the great evils that afflict our land. You exhibit naked the which most needs to be reminded. And by doing this, in a humorous vein which you carry through to skillfully by relating history and anecdotes of daily occurrences, either employing irony or sarcasm, you hold the facts to ridicule and draw from the reader a cry of indignation. Your devoted friend and admirer, El Proscrito. Ritana says the principal conclusions of Noli Me Tangere, and these are the following. The enlightened liberal Filipino cannot live in the Philippines because he and the friars are uncongenial. He is persecuted in every way. False conspiracies are invented to implicate him, and then he is imprisoned, exiled, or shot. Second, the country is not for us, but for Spaniards, especially the friars. Next is the civil guard is so abusive that it makes more bandits that its capture. Next, the Spaniards in the Philippines have no high ideals, but many of them have degenerated into ruffians. The Catholic religion has been employed as an instrument of domination. Next, the pure Filipinos are condemned to perpetual ignorance. And the woman cannot marry a Spaniard but gives herself to the friar of her parents, oblige her to do so, protect themselves. With the present bad government, the Filipinos cannot remain united with Spain, and with all courtesy, we ask for the rights we deserve. The chief cause of insurrection and desperation, when a man possesses all he has, he fights. Vigilant spies carried Noli Me Tangere to the government and the government appointed a committee from the University of Santo Tomas to examine it. The committee did a thorough job. The rector of Santo Tomas reported to Archbishop, "In returning the copy you sent us, we noted with a red pencil the statements against Spain. The government and its representatives in these islands, with a blue or black pencil other statements, is impious, heretical, scandalous, or objectionable for other reasons. All the narrative, absolutely all taken together and in its details. The important and unimportant incidents are against doctrine, against the church, against the religious orders, and against the institutions, civil, military, social, and political, which the government of Spain has implanted in these islands." Noli Me Tangere of Jose Rizal, printed in Berlin, if circulated in the Philippines, would cause the gravest dangers to faith and morals, lessen or kill the love of these natives for Spain, stir up the passions of the inhabitants of the country, and cause sad days for the mother country. A government decree followed at once excluding the book from the Philippines, requiring a search for any copies of it that might be in the islands, and providing that any Filipino found with Noli Me Tangere in his possession should be deported and his property confiscated and given to the person who should betray him. The decree had no effect except to advertise his book and to enhance the popularity of its writer. Copies were smuggled into to be read secretly. They were buried in fields at the approach of officers and dug up when the officers had gone. Even Rizal's friends, the Jesuits, turned against him. When he visited the Ateneo, Padre Federico Fora, knowing the change, and the great wickedness which had put enmity into his soul, tried to bring him back to the right road, but in vain. For unfortunate for the man with obstinate coldness, though making a great profession of being loyal to Spain, said that all discussion of the religion was useless, for he had already lost the inestimable treasure of his faith. Padre Fora then said that if his beliefs were like that, he is no more set his feet within the Ateneo. Not until some 5 months had passed, Rizal was called. Malacanang, the governor's now presidential palace, to interview with Governor General Emilio Terrero, who told him the Dominican committee had found Noli Me Tangere dangerous. Rizal assured Terrero that the book was innocent of the slightest slander against the government, though it did reveal so prior injustice, and asked him to read it before passing judgment. The Governor-General agreed to read the book and was secretly pleased at its exposure of the friars. At his next interview, he was very friendly, and being solicitous for Rizal's welfare, gave him bodyguard, Lieutenant Jose Taviel de Andrade, a Spaniard. We became one of Rizal's warmest admirers and friends, and remained to the end of his life, partly or wholly as a result of reading Noli Me Tangere. Governor-General Terrero started an investigation of the notorious inequalities. So that's all for my part. Thank you for listening, and God bless everyone.
Good day, everyone. Now let us move on to the next part.
which is the Philly, subversive. So when we say subversive, it is the second novel of Jose Rizal in 1861 to 1896. So it is called the Il Filibusterismo. So, before Rizal left the Europe, he had to edit and publish Il Filibusterismo, which is the last chapters of which he had finished in Biarritz while still courting Nelly Bosted. So Paris, being expensive, was out of the question for the printing of his second novel, and so Rizal hurried back to Brussels and later to Ghent in search of cheap printers. On October 18, 1891, Rizal sailed from Marseilles to buy a ticket courtesy of Bassa. With him were 600 copies of Il Filibusterismo. So in his next novel, Il Filibusterismo, published in 1891, so Rizal continued to argue for reform. So El Filibusterismo is a book about revolution, positing it clearly as an alternative to reform efforts that lead nowhere. So the age of filibustering took place after the terror of 1872, and for 20 years, there was a demand for reform. So then, the Evolutionary Society, the Katipunan, was founded to further Philippine independence. So the influence of the age of filibustering is obvious in Rizal's two novels. From his vantage point, Rizal argued that the Spanish needed to rethink their political, religious, and economic direction. In his novel, Rizal was able to extend this criticism into new directions. In the preface to his original 1891 edition, Rizal wrote from Europe. It says that the specter of subversion has been used so often to frighten us that from being a mere nursery tale, it has acquired a real and positive existence, whose mere mention makes us commit the greatest mistakes. So Rizal urged his people not to accept Spanish myth and look to themselves for an inner freedom in the national direction. Il Filibusterismo was dedicated to the three friars, namely Don Mariano Gomez, Don Jose Burgos, and Don Jacinto Zamora, or what we called the Gumbursa, who were executed on the scaffold at Bagumbayan on February 28, 1872. So Rizal's first novel, Noli Me Tangere, Leon Maria Guerrero suggests that Rizal was the first Asian nationalist to emerge from the Philippines. What sets Rizal's novel apart from other Philippine fiction is his commitment to a sense of independent nationalism. A sense of pride and a celebration of Filipino values permeate his work. Also, there was a worldwide audience for his books as they were published in Europe, read in the United States, and debated throughout Southeast Asia. Next is the Phyllis theme. Jose Rizal's main contribution as a novelist was to expose the malevolent white colonial attitudes that permeated the world in the late 19th century. In Il Filibusterismo, one of the sub-themes in Rizal's dissection of colonialism, he talks at length about the civilizing mission of Spanish officials, and then he demonstrates how colonial government over 3 centuries degraded Philippine life. So Rizal discusses Philippine history in his fiction. Rizal's theme is often one of local division and fighting. The divisions among his people, Rizal argues, is what prevents them from attaining total freedom. The educated Filipino is split from the working class people. So Simon, the main character in Il Filibusterismo, is an important symbol because he argues that by accepting the Spanish way of life, Philippine nationalism is in danger of being lost. There is no real sense of Philippine history, Rizal argues, and the colonial conquerors have brainwashed Filipinos into accepting European ways. So here comes the Hispanization. It is considered detrimental to the Philippines, and Rizal makes a strong case for resistance to all Spanish influences. His main argument is that the Spanish do not accept Filipinos in religious, economic, or political matters, and the prejudices of the local rulers make independence an impossible task. Rizal urges Filipinos to take matters into their own hands and create a strong nationalism. So the main theme of the Philly suggests that colonialism has a divisive influence upon the Philippines. The Spaniards who continually search for self-fulfillment, prestige, and a special status bear out all of the evils of the colonial mentality. The Philly demonstrates that conflicting nationalism cannot exist side by side, and revolution is inevitable. Okay, so here comes the Simon's advocacy. So the arguments for a separate nationalism are put forth by Simon when he questions the Spanish way of life and the destruction of his own national identity. So a people without a soul, nation without freedom, everything in you will be borrowed, even your defects. So that was Simon's remarks. For the Spanish, one of the frightening aspects of el filibusterismo was the revolutionary rhetoric and formal planning for native rule, which Simon remarks, "You ask the parity of rights, the Spanish way of life, and you do not realize that what you are asking is death, the destruction of your national identity, the disappearance of your homeland." But in the conclusion of the Philly, Simon is visited on his deathbed by a native priest who informs him that the revolution will fail because Filipinos are not ready for independence. Although his plans for revolution are failed once, his dying patriot gives hope for the future. His message is that revolution and subsequent independence provide the future political direction. So lastly, the Philly dedicated to the three martyrs. So El Filibusterismo was dedicated to the Gumbursa, who had been martyred in Rizal's childhood. So the Philly's first page reads, Don Mariano Gomez, 85 years old, Don Jose Burgos, 30 years old, and Don Jacinto Zamora, 35 years old. They were executed in Bagumbayan Field on February 28, 1872. So the book says, I have a right to dedicate my book to you as victims of the evil that I undertake to combat. And while we wait expectantly for Spain someday to restore your good name and cease to be answerable for your death, let these pages serve as a tardy wreath of dried leaves over your unknown tombs. And let it be understood that everyone that without clear proof attacks your memory stains his hands in your blood. So el filibusterismo is the passionately bitter cry of soul torture and baffles us what to do. The book has little humor, such as we find reliving the pages of No Limitangere. So the writer was in no mood to write jokes, unless they were better satire. No Limitangere had been friendly to the government and had denounced only certain types of friars and others. El filibusterismo has lost faith in Spain. So the two books were 4 years apart, and what terrible 4 years they had been, and what they had done to disillusion Jose Rizal.
Good day, everyone. I'm the one who has tasked to discuss in praise of Philip. El Filibusterismo was read with the enthusiasm by the most of the Filipinos. From Barcelona came his glowing tribute signed with the 12s of Rizal's colony. Distinguished patriot with unprecedented enthusiasm, this Filipino colony of Barcelona has read the new production, the original style, which is comparable only to the sublime Alexander Dumas, and may well be offered as a model and precious jewel in the decadent days of Spanish literature. Like Nolly, this book drew every character from real life. Manuel Camus from Singapore wrote, I want to thank you for the exactness of the type of Captain Tino, the steamship. He was my uncle. So, based on the revise, kanang gi-describe dire kung unsay kalahian sa Nolly og sa El Filibusterismo. Perhaps the best appraisal of the book among the scores of flattering letters is that of loyal Graciano Lopez Haina. El Filibusterismo is a better novel than Noli Me Tangere in its profound ideas and sublime thoughts. So, bisa ko isulti ganina, kanang gi-compare ang Noli o El Filibusterismo. Yeah, dali sad gisulti nga murag mas better pagkahimo ang mga sulod sa El Fili than sa Noli Me Tangere. Such was almost universal feeling among the friends of Rizal that he had written a magnificent book and spoiled it with his last chapter. However, in the light of the glorious way in which Rizal died, men are able to realize that in the last chapter are the noblest words he ever wrote. The book was a tremendous, if painful, sermon to those of Rizal's own countrymen who believed they could defraud their fellow countrymen, live two glazed lives, and still expected that good would come. Then, ayon na ta sa sunod, maong ang part sa saving the best for last. The other things beside money that detained Rizal in Europe was publication of his next book, El Filibusterismo, the sequel to Noli Me Tangere, which he had toiling for 3 years. So, dili nang di ay ang kwarta, ang reason maong na priso si Rizal sa Europe. Ako nag-stay siya sa Europe. Kuan ay ang publication sa iyang next book, which is The El Filibusterismo. Rizal said that his book is ready to go to the press. The first 20 chapters are already corrected and can be printed. He is copying the remaining chapters, and if he got the money, the receiver will receive it on July. So, dili day nadungan siya og print, di ba? Na tagi-tagi day siya tungod kay kuwang ang money ni Rizal. So, narita sa sunod, he wrote it more zeal than Nolly, even though it is not optimistic, but it is more profound than more perfect. Rizal replied to loyal Basa to not send any more telegrams to his account for it pains him to think of spending so much money. At last, Rizal did find a publisher in Ghent who was willing to begin the book on a small partial payment. So, nangita pa din si Rizal dire sa mo-publish sa iyang book sa kanang mas makatles siya ba. So, ari na ta sa sunod, which is The Search of the Third Novel. Academic community and other Rizal scholars cannot believe and conclude that Rizal had only two novels with these premise. Perhaps it is logical to ask if there is really a third novel. Number 1. Los Trabajos Literarios. This manuscript with the same title was recovered during circa 1938 prior to the World War II from the house of Mariano Ponce. This manuscript relates trip with his experience with the hambog na Amerikano. So, ang Los Trabajos Literarios kay manuscript na siya nga ang sulod sa manuscript is kanang mga experience ni Rizal sa iyang trip kauban ang mga hambog nga Amerikano. So rita sa ikaduha which is ang dalawang magkapatid known also as Cuento Tendencioso escrito in Tagalog. In one of the books of Ocampo, the original researcher of these items who saw the Aqua manuscript has this to say, unfortunately, the borrador is too short to tell whether it's an essay or short story or a novel. So, aritas katulo is Omrombuso Gobernado Silio, which some semblance to the characters and plot of, of the Noli. This Borador is believed to be the first two pages of the Noli. Therefore, it cannot qualify as a third novel. So there are other five titles which, for some reason, cannot qualify as Rizal's third novel. So, Costumeres Filipina, Los Animales de Juan, Principios de una Novela Satírica, Principios de una Novela Histórica, Memorias de un Gallo. So, Dr. Angel Hidalgo, a scholar and direct ascendant of Rizal, being the grandson of Saturnina, he believed that this is the third novel of Rizal. However, Leoncio Lopez Rizal, another authority in the Rizal clan, silenced him with his words that cannot be because the manuscript in question is a drop of Noli Me Tangere, nothing more. Ocampo believed that this third novel was written by Rizal while on the ship Melbourne route to Hong Kong from Mirasalis in October 9, 1891. He placed the date through the letter if Rizal to Blumentritt saying Rizal was now writing his third novel. The date was on October 1891. So, salamat!